So it's late May, you're in Minneapolis, it's early morning. Set the scene on that day.
Well, that day we were there on that scene in the early morning, basically covering our morning shift for CNN, as we had been for days leading up to that point, trying to set the scene for what a new day was going to look like when the attention of the world really was on that city of Minneapolis at the time, as police were clashing with protesters and as people were trying to get their story heard in a way that actually was meaningful.
Okay, but the street was burning behind you. There had been riots all night. I think this was the third night of riots, and you've got a line of riot police standing behind you. And just so we catch the audience up to speed, let's roll a little bit of what happened next.
And this is a scene here playing out in Minneapolis. This is part of the advanced police presence that we saw come over the course of really minutes when the local police showed up at the fire department, or with the fire department, I should say, on that building we showed you that was burning. This is among the state patrol unit that was advancing up the street, saying and scattering the protesters at that point for people to clear the area. And so we walked away. I'm sorry?
You're under arrest.
Okay. Do you mind telling me why I'm under arrest, sir? Why am I under arrest, sir?
Under arrest, Omar, why were they taking you away? You were saying you would move to a place where they wanted you. Clearly, they were trying to clean the area and clear it, but why?
In that moment, and even still to this day, we have no idea why I was arrested in that moment. You're right. They were trying to clear that area, and we actually watched them clear the area from a distance that was out of their way. And we had actually done part of a previous report standing in front of that police line with them in the background, getting as close as we thought possible to the scene without actually being in it. But it turns out that changed. And a few minutes later, as you saw in that video, our crew ended our report being led away in handcuffs.
You were pretty calm through the whole thing. What were you thinking?
Well, in that moment, I was just thinking about trying to make it out of that situation. I knew a lot of people were watching. Obviously, it was playing out live on television. I didn't know what was in their heads, because clearly in their heads, things had escalated to a point, quote unquote, escalated to a point where they felt that they needed to lead us away in handcuffs. And so there were a lot of unknowns in my head. So I was trying to play it as cautiously as possible, just until I could figure out exactly what was going on.
So what this example represented for all of us is further confirmation that as journalists, we're not a special status anymore. Particularly in urban conflicts, the fact that we are identified as press doesn't give us special status. What do you think about that?
Well, I think it's a reminder where it's always sort of been in the back of our minds, depending on what types of situations you go into. Now, it's different when you're walking into a White House press briefing or something where your credentials mean so much more and you have to show those credentials. But in these scenarios where at the end of the day, it comes down to you and the scene happening around you, the same can be said for natural disasters when you're covering hurricanes, fires, wildfires in California or elsewhere, or protests like these. Press credentials and showing that badge really means nothing, because you, in that moment, whether you like it or not as a member of the press, are now just part of whatever volatile situation is actually happening. You don't always see that play out and exemplified at the hands of police, but of course, we saw that play out here, since police would usually be the people that you would show your credentials to sort of get out of the situation or show why you should be here. But it was those same people that ended up going past that credential and, again, leading our crew away in cuffs just for doing our jobs.
Yeah, a couple of nights later, I was in Minneapolis as well. And, when the riot police were trying to clear the protesters again, they shot on our crew. I got hit in the shoulder and in the backside with a tear gas canister and a rubber bullet. But it's not unique. I've been in situations before where we have been a target as they're trying to clear the area. Why is it important to you that we are allowed some freedom to report unobstructed?
Well, for starters, it's in the United States Constitution, but of course, the freedom of the press, they are the eyes and the ears of the people. when you look at the protests and what happened in Minneapolis, the world would not have seen the demonstrations that happened there and the ferocity of the demonstrations if it were not for members of the press being able to tell that story, either visually or writing about it. If it were not for the members of the press being able to interview people about what the real pain and message was behind some of the more violent protesting that we saw in some cases descend into the nighttime. So getting the story out there helps everybody. Because if you have done nothing wrong, or you felt like you've done nothing wrong, whether you're a member of the police or otherwise, you also get to tell your side of the story. So being able to have us there on the scene covering is important for absolutely everyone. And when you don't discriminate who's reporting as a member of the press professionally versus who is just there as a protester, you damage some of that. And particularly when it's a story about relationship between members of the community and police, it doesn't do anyone on the police side any favors.
Omar, we work in a country where the president regularly calls the press the enemy. Is it surprising then that the police have adopted a view that we are part of the combatants?
Well, it's something we have to think about increasingly so every day, because when you have that type of messaging coming from the very top, I think you almost, in some cases, if you feel wronged as a reporter, you tell someone, and then depending on the seriousness of it, it escalates and escalates and escalates. But eventually the buck stops with who's leading. And if the person who's in ultimate leadership of this country is calling the press the enemy of the people, all of a sudden the complaints, the risks that we feel we are taking when going to do our job, we don't quite know or feel that we're going to have the same protection and backing from the U.S. government. And that's just speaking on American soil, but even more so when you go to other countries to tell some of those stories that are affecting Americans. Will the government have our backs? And it's a question that we're increasingly asking every day.
In conflict zones, often not. It's pretty chaotic. Has this changed the way you would go into an urban conflict like that, where there's rioting and demonstrations and very, very tense situation?
It hasn't altered it significantly, but I'd be lying if it hadn't altered it a little bit, because at least going into this, I never imagined that me doing a report in the middle of one of these stories would end in myself and my crew being led away in handcuffs. I'd imagine potentially getting hit with a brick or with a rock or some sort of debris or getting caught up in the protests. But now this is another factor that I think we have to consider. Now, will that slow us down in trying to do our job as rigorously and as passionately as we believe we need to do? No, because I firmly believe that this shouldn't stop what we were there to do. And I firmly believe we were in the right in doing what we did. So in that sense, it won't slow me down. But of course, it is now in my head. And what I do think about is I had the backing of CNN behind me to get me out and pour their resources into getting me out as quickly as possible. Not everyone has that luxury, and not everyone is even 100% affiliated with an organization if they're coming in as a freelance. And those are the scenarios we really need to keep an eye on in conflicts like this in the future.
And just very briefly, did you ever get an explanation about why they wanted to get you out of that street?
Never got an explanation on the scene. Never got an explanation on social media or out in the world afterwards. The closest thing was the governor, who eventually just apologized and said that this should have never happened in the first place.
All right. Well, thank you very much for sharing your story.
Of course.
All right.